I've just read a message from a Chinese friend, whereby she sent me a link about Japan's war crimes. This is a Chinese friend. I've sometimes had this experience whereby Chinese people have tried to sort of prove to me how awful Japan was in the war, but actually they're preaching to the converted, because I know full well how awful Japan was in the war. And I do think that this is motivated by the sort of nationalism that is very prevalent in East Asia right now. From an outside perspective, I find it quite depressing, and I politely told my friend that I knew what she was trying to say, but it made me uncomfortable. But inevitably it's got me thinking. By chance I was actually reading about this situation today. The background is that Shinzo Abe, who must be one of Japan's most influential post-war prime ministers, and not exactly for all the good reasons, has basically got a bill passed through Parliament to amend part of the Japanese constitution. I don't know the details, but basically this means that almost 70 years of Japanese pacifism is being overturned, so that essentially Japan can now engage its troops in armed conflicts abroad. I got this Time magazine copy from a few months ago. I'll show you the cover. Shinzo Abe, the Patriot. And what it says here is, Shinzo Abe dreams of a more powerful Japan, a more powerful assertive Japan. Why that makes many people uncomfortable. Now, Abe's been Prime Minister, this is his second time. His first time between 06 and 07 was relatively uneventful, but this second period, which I believe began in 2012, but don't quote me on that, is longer and a lot more assertive. Abe is making his mark. I mean, to put things in context, it's extremely rare that a Japanese Prime Minister appears on the cover of Time magazine, because most Japanese Prime Ministers come and go. Abe is making his mark. So I don't know whether this is driven by ego, or, as that suggests, patriotism. And by the way, before people attack Time, I think that's not their opinion, that's just going by what he regards himself as. Abe is one of a certain sector of Japanese politicians who feel that in recent years they've been pushed around and humiliated by the rise of China. That's my perspective anyway, because what has essentially happened over the last 10 years is there's been a switchover. Japan was for years the world's second largest economy, it's now third. And Japan has watched cautiously as China has risen economically. It's now a powerhouse, economic powerhouse. Japan has, whilst it's still a wealthy country, it has been in financial doldrums for years. Its growth rate is nowhere near that of China's. So I think there's a real identity crisis in Japan, and that has implications for the wider region, because China and Japan are the two major powers of the East Asia region. South Korea is also an assertive force, but really Japan and China are the two big powers of the region. So this new militaristic approach has provoked a lot of controversy. The thing I want to highlight to Chinese people watching this, they may not be aware, but actually it's also controversial in Japan itself. And I saw this featured on CCTV. A lot of Japanese people are not happy about what Abe is doing. And there was protests outside his office in Tokyo. I read one man even set himself on fire. That's how strongly some Japanese people feel about this, because they believe that he's taking the country in the wrong direction. And I don't know whether it's war guilt or the fact that they recognise that Japan's pacifism has arguably been for its own good. I mean, I have to say here, I am speaking as an outsider, this is just an outside perspective, but clearly nationalism is running very high in East Asia. And I think it's a case that all the leaders in the region are to some extent responsible for provoking this nationalism. firstly, I'm fully aware of what Japan done in the war. Let's not forget they also mistreated Allied prisoners of war. So when Chinese people try to sort of, I get the impression they think Europeans are ignorant about what Japan done. That's not the case. We're fully aware of what Japan done. But from a European perspective, what I see is a huge amount of nationalism in the region that is unnecessary. It doesn't need to be that way. And it's very sad to see this happening. I don't actually think there's going to be a war between China and Japan. I really hope not. But my core instinct is this is a lot of hot air, basically, between leaders. It's muscle flexing. And every country involved is being very defensive. Now, I can understand some of the context because Japan has sent out mixed messages in terms of its war guilt. On one hand, there's been a lot of official apologies for what they've done. On the other hand, there's continued visits to the Yasukuni Shrine. Now, the Yasukuni Shrine, it has to be pointed out, honours all Japanese war casualties. It's not just to generals and officers. This honours just normal privates. Now, every country in the world, in my opinion, has a right to honour its war dead. The problem is the Yasukuni Shrine also honours convicted war criminals. So I can understand Chinese anger about that. It would be the equivalent of Angela Merkel in Germany visiting a shrine basically honouring SS officers. It's essentially the same thing, but Germany doesn't do that. And look at Germany, it's a successful, prosperous country that, rather than being isolated from its continent, is at the very heart of its continent. Japan has the opposite problem, it's isolated. So, I should say the opposite scenario. However, I think it's wrong to blame all of this solely on Japan, because from my perspective there's a great deal of hypocrisy in the Chinese position. I'm not saying what they're saying about Japan's war crimes are wrong. Those events are well documented. But I do think it's hypocritical, the situation whereby in China people can protest against Japan. They can protest against Japanese companies. They can voice anger at Japan's current approach, etc., etc. But when it comes to protests against the CCP, for example about corruption, the approach of the Chinese government is brute force, crushing it, censorship. So it seems to me, of course officially, the CCP will say we don't encourage violence, and you know, if people are sort of smashing up Japanese cars and that sort of thing, officially the Chinese government will say we don't condone that, we are not encouraging violence. But I think behind the scenes they're actually promoting a neo-nationalism. Now, to his credit, Xi Jinping has made some improvements in China in terms of social progress. However, his administration is also fostering an extreme nationalism, which I think is very dangerous for the wider region. So what you essentially have, this is my perspective, in the East Asia region, is leaders who are basically all hawks. Abe is a hawk, Xi Jinping is a hawk, Kim Jong-un, well, everyone knows what a complete nutjob he is. President Park in South Korea, I believe she's possibly the most pragmatic leader in the region, to her credit. I get quite a good impression from her, although I'm not saying that she's perfect. I don't know enough about her to say that, but basically I think the responsibility lies in all countries involved. It's unfair to put all the responsibility on Japan, because after all, every country in the world has a right to defend itself. Japan does have a right to defend itself, and having war guilt doesn't take away that basic right. Because what has happened in the last 10 years, China has become a very powerful country, so for China to constantly promote the victimhood mentality I think is a little bit phony. China is a very different country from what it was in the days of World War II, when it really was the underdog, and it was a case of noble peasants fighting Japanese aggressors. Today you have a very powerful, very assertive China that in many ways is throwing its weight around the region. Not against Japan, but against smaller countries like Vietnam and the Philippines over fishing disputes. So it's a little bit hypocritical for China to play the victimhood card whilst they are bullying countries like Vietnam. Now, I'm sorry, but that is just the outside perspective. That is how it looks. And I'm not saying Japan is right, but I'm saying China, before it plays the victimhood card, it should also have a look in the mirror and look at some of its own behaviour in the region. Because, I mean, take for example this extended sea zone. I forget the formal title, but not long ago there was widespread condemnation that China enacted a block around the Pacific, a huge chunk of water, which they called their, I think it was the Sea Defence Zone or something like that. Now that was a provocative move. So to blame everything on Japan is unfair. When China does acts like that, you can't expect Japan not to respond. And I know a lot of this comes down to the dispute over the Diaoyu/Senkaku Islands. Now I have to say, in that dispute I really am neutral. As far as I'm concerned, they're a bunch of rocks. But the real issue is not the islands. It's, I think, partly its resources and partly its national pride. I just think it's very sad to see the sort of neo-nationalism that is being fostered across the East Asia region. It's very obvious in South Korea, it's very obvious in China, and it is also obvious in Japan, although in both South Korea and Japan the difference is they're democratic societies whereby it's legal to protest against the government. Especially in Japan, whatever faults Japan has, no one can accuse Japan of not being a democracy, because it is. And that is a fundamental difference with China. Japanese people can protest against the government, Chinese people can't. So if you're Chinese and you're watching this, do consider that fact. In other words, I can understand your anger about Japanese policy, but you also need to be objective and think, well, can we voice dissent against our government if they do something we don't like, for example about corruption? I know you can voice dissent online, although it's still tightly controlled, but I'm talking about really voicing peaceful dissent, because in China the government keeps a very cast iron grip on protests, and it's classed as disrupting the peace, sort of subjugating state power, this sort of thing. So there's a lot of dynamics to this. In conclusion, I think that East Asia can learn from the European experience. I'm not proposing exactly an Asian Union. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, because the ASEAN is nowhere near as unified as the European Union, although certainly the EU is very controversial in many member states. But for all its faults, one major achievement of the EU is guaranteeing peace for 60 plus years between European states. Not once has an EU member declared war on another EU member since the bloc's formation. Not once. Yes, there's been heated disputes at times, but basically the EU is so successful that it is unimaginable for Britain or France or Germany to even contemplate using the word war in terms of a dispute. Yes, there might be diplomatic noise, there might be disagreement. For example, with the Iraq intervention there was big disputes between Britain and France, situations like that. But it's unimaginable for two EU countries to go to war. Sadly, in East Asia it's not unimaginable. I don't think it will happen, because I believe behind the scenes these leaders are not stupid. They know that it would not be in their own interest to go to war. I think they know that. But another Sino-Japanese war, let's imagine a third Sino-Japanese war, it would be utterly catastrophic. And it's not just China and Japan that are players in this region. Look at the Koreas. Look at the behaviour of North Korea, which China has been far too dismissive of. I know they've condemned the nuclear situation, but you know, they've been far too basically placating of the North, when the North has behaved in ways that are utterly unacceptable, openly threatening war against South Korea and Japan, and completely, in my view, betraying their only ally, which is China. So North Korea's behaviour is extremely reckless. I believe it's one of the most dangerous threats in the entire region, and China should be equally concerned about North Korea as it is about Japan. I know ideologically they're close, but China should recognise that North Korea's behaviour jeopardises the entire region. Having said that, I think Shinzo Abe is also being reckless in this hawkish approach. I do understand the Japanese need to be more assertive, but I believe there's other ways to do it, rather than militarism. Japan should take measures to have economic growth, which no one could fault. That would be something that China could not criticise. But militarism is something that is always going to be provocative in a region that is still dealing with ghosts from the past. So from a European perspective, by the way, people who think I'm sort of interfering, what I would say is this: China and Japan are the world's second and third biggest economies, so it does have global implications what happens in this region. It's not an internal issue. This has global implications. The United States, of course, is involved. Britain, less so. But it does have global implications. I mean, Britain has trade with both countries. I guarantee you, a country like Britain does not want to see a war between China and Japan. So if you're from one of these countries, I would plead with you, please be objective. I'm not saying don't be angry, but please try and be objective. If you're Chinese, don't demonize all Japanese people because of what Shinzo Abe is doing. Because look at the facts, that he does not represent all Japanese people. Also look at your own country, because the CCP is not honest about Chinese history. If they were, they would allow information about sensitive modern Chinese subjects to be made easily available. So I guess I'm going to be attacked by all sides here because people will think I'm biased. I'm really not. I'm saying this as a citizen of the world. I don't want to see war in this region. I think it would be heartbreaking to see that happen again. There's millions of people suffered in World War II. For goodness sake, let's be responsible and not let nationalism blind us to trying to reach some sort of understanding. And ultimately, it is public responsibility, but I also think it's government's responsibility. So it falls on Shinzo Abe, it falls on Xi Jinping, it falls on President Park in South Korea. I won't say Kim Jong-un because the guy's utterly unstable. But those three leaders, President Park, President Xi and Prime Minister Abe, have responsibility in this region. And in terms of the fishing disputes with China, I believe the Vietnamese government also has responsibility to home in on those who were causing violence against the Chinese community in Vietnam. At the same time, China has no right to be bullying smaller countries. So there's all sorts of disputes going on in this region, and I think all governments have responsibility. And I really hope people could be more objective and less nationalistic.